So the structure of the government under Stalin, there are three major government organizations that you should be familiar with. They sort of go up in terms of power. There's a clear hierarchy in place here. The Central Committee is the first structure, and this was actually an organization, a section of government that was much more powerful when Lenin was around. When Stalin took over, as we know, the government transforms much more into a totalitarian dictatorship. So that's why this says that under Lenin, the Central Committee was the apex of political power. All right, so the Central Committee was relatively large. It had 70 people in it in the 1930s, and it was the major decision-making body in the government. But after Lenin dies, you start to see the Politburo start to replace the Central Committee in terms of power. So the Politburo, the major difference is that it's much smaller. It has 12 people in it instead of the 70. And ultimately, it sort of eclipsed the Central Committee because as Russia became more of a totalitarian state, the idea was to be able to have a political body that could make much faster decisions. It goes without saying that when you have a larger political body, there's much more room for disagreement. Legislative actions or whatever the decision is going to be slowed down with a larger group. But the Politburo, since it is smaller in size, can decide on matters much faster when it isn't able to wait for the Central Committee to come to a decision. And then the ultimate pinnacle of power lay in the General Secretary position. This was what Stalin was. He was the General Secretary of the USSR. Right? So see the General Secretary as what ultimately became a dictatorial position. It was created by Stalin, and ultimately the General Secretary becomes the de facto leader of the Soviet Union. So that's what the General Secretary is, and it's a new position that emerges under Stalin. You didn't have a General Secretary exist prior to that. Okay, so how is Stalin able to secure his totalitarian regime? So this is similar for all the totalitarian governments that we're going to talk about in this chapter. Propaganda is a very significant tool that allows Stalin to glorify the state, to glorify the work that he's doing for the population, even if ultimately there are some major victims, even if, like with the example of the 5-year plans, you had massive casualties. The idea was, using propaganda, you could basically only paint one version of the truth, making it so that Stalin was good, Stalin was godlike, even if he was doing serious damage to the social structure, the economy, and so on. So basically what someone like Stalin could do through propaganda was to, first off, make all the work that the Soviet people were doing, particularly in the 5-year plans, developing industry, collectivizing farms, to glorify that work, right? To basically explain that, these people are doing work for the state, making the Soviet Union better. So that was one major thing that propaganda would do. The idea was to actually encourage people to produce more. Whether or not that actually works is under debate. As we know, collectivization was not particularly successful, especially among the peasants who had just gotten land for the first time in their history. You actually had peasants slaughter their animals instead of get them taken by the government. So, does it encourage production? That is up for debate. As what distinguishes this type of propaganda, what makes this totalitarian government that you would not have under conservative authoritarianism, of course, is the modern technology that makes this propaganda possible. So newspapers, for example, this is Pravda, a newspaper in Russia that meant the truth. That's what Pravda means. All right, and again, there's no ability, there's no freedom of the press that exists to offer a countering opinion. So Pravda was what came out. Pravda was what people read. You also had film work as propaganda. I think I mentioned the previous chapter that Sergei Eisenstein, one of the most well-known filmmakers in this era in the Soviet Union, he was commissioned by Stalin's government to make very patriotic films. Ultimately, the idea was to glorify the emergence of the Soviet Union, glorify the Bolsheviks, leave absolutely no sympathy for the white Russians or the Tsarist regime that came before. All right, so Sergei Eisenstein is a good name to be familiar with, and just make sure that you are aware that it is under these types of films that propaganda is so prominent throughout the Soviet Union, right? So he is the quintessential filmmaker. He makes it seem as though Stalin actually existed even during the Bolshevik Revolution, which is not true. It sort of reminds me of North Korea, where, you know, the idea is that someone like Kim Il-sung is godlike. He has always been around. He continues to be around. Kim Il-sung is seen as still alive by the North Korean people now, even though clearly he's been dead for decades. All right, the same kind of idea pertained to Stalin during this period. Through propaganda, Stalin had already lived when he wasn't around and continued to live on. Writers and artists, they were expected to glorify Stalin and their state, so anything that you produced was very closely monitored by the government. Anything that went against Stalin's message would be viciously censored, and you ultimately could get yourself in a lot of trouble. You could get purged. You could end up far, far away from the central government in a Siberian labor camp if you did not watch what you say or did not watch what you write. You also saw religion be persecuted. The idea, again, was that communism itself was really meant to be the new religion of the USSR. So the USSR, when it becomes communist, emerges as a secular state. So you're not going to see the influence of the Orthodox Church anymore. And actually this is a little image from a magazine that's called The Godless. So taking away religion is another important way that Stalin can sort of promote propaganda, that religion now is actually also promoting the state, not any sort of individualism or uniqueness. All right, so how does the government actually provide some benefits for the working class? Well, the policies that were carried forth by Stalin during this time were much more beneficial to the urban populations. They really were not helpful to the rural peasantry. Things like old age pensions were provided, free medical services, education, daycare centers for children. So obviously this makes it much easier for the urban working class to attend work, especially when their children are taken care of, when their children have schooling, when there's some sort of supervision for them. The ability to work until you're of retired age and then free up that position for someone who is, of able-bodied working age is very significant. So the old age pensions very much ensure that there's always an able-bodied workforce. Education became much more promoted during this period in the Soviet Union. Education was seen as key to improving one's position in this sort of one's socioeconomic position, right? Education would help you specialize skills in your technical education, or technical technical prowess. You would basically be able to produce something better. You would be able to have a very ideal technical job once you achieved an education. Russians often saw themselves as sort of transcending the Depression, which was affecting all of Western Europe and the United States at this point. And to a large extent, this is true. The Soviet Union continued to produce at a very high rate, and unemployment was basically non-existent in a socialist economy, where you saw unemployment reach 25% in the United States, 43% in Germany. So in a lot of ways, actually, during the Great Depression, some Westerners sort of became disillusioned to capitalism. They saw the Depression as a sign that capitalism was failing. And you actually had some Westerners start to get attracted to communism during the 1930s. So women, actually, arguably, women changed the most in the Soviet Union during this age of totalitarianism. When we look at the fascist state of Italy and Germany, we're going to see that women are sort of confined to more traditional roles. So the Russian Revolution was supposed to proclaim complete equality of the rights for women. All right, and some of the ways you see this in particular was that divorce and abortion became easily available starting in the 1920s. Women actually were urged by the state to work outside the home and even liberate themselves sexually, which is very, very ahead of its time for the 1920s, when there was still a huge stigma associated with sort of overt sexual behavior by women in Western countries. Women oftentimes would gain a superior education. A lot of times they actually found themselves on par job-wise with their male counterparts. So you actually had women work as professionals, women emerge into fields like medicine for the first time. And the only thing that you could say really makes, I guess the only example of women not making so much progress in this instance is, despite that their increased role in the public sphere, women were still expected to do household chores in their off hours, and Soviet men kind of considered home this place to relax, and children were their wives' responsibilities. So that's one way that women still remained unequal to men. But in terms of jobs, women made significant headway in the Soviet Union during this period. Men still did monopolize the best jobs, so this doesn't mean women had complete equality in employment, but the fact that they were getting outside of the house and working in such mass numbers was very significant. It also shows how much transition to communism is going to affect the economy. You also saw, in some ways, women kind of had to work once communism was instilled in the Soviet Union, because the 5-year plans, as well as low wages, sort of made work necessary. Women had to work to supplement their husband's income. Also, this very rapid change in the economy, as well as some economic hardship that made women have to work, did contribute to some broken families. There was a higher likelihood of divorce. So this wasn't completely a positive and liberating change. To a certain extent, the whole core of what made a family was sort of torn apart in these early years. Okay, so last but not least, how does Stalin ensure that the new structure of government, the new structure of the economy, is not challenged by anyone? Ultimately terrorizing people to do anything but dissent, right? So this period in the mid to late 1930s, referred to as the Great Terror, or also the Great Purge, is a way that Stalin was able to basically get rid of any sort of dissent against the government. All right, at first it was directed against peasants specifically, so this happens after 1929 or so. What's interesting is that the purge was actually directed against communists themselves, against leading communists. So people who could potentially emerge to challenge Stalin for power, very powerful administrators, or just ordinary people, would often be targeted by Stalin's government for no apparent reason. So why was Stalin targeting communists and not, people who are maybe supporting capitalism? In a way, it was to instill fear in the population that ultimately anyone could be targeted by Stalin's government. The Great Terror actually arrested 8 million different people being arrested, and oftentimes after they were arrested, they were subject to what was called show trials, which in other words is a criminal trial where the verdict is already decided. The people who are going before these trials were already deemed guilty as far as the judge was concerned. Right, and the idea was to kind of make an example of these people to again scare people from dissenting. A lot of people who faced show trials were ex-party members, and again, the public nature of the trial was meant to serve as a warning. You actually had many old Bolsheviks, so people who were following Lenin in particular, get tried and executed during these great purges. You had army officials targeted specifically by the Great Purges. 40,000 army officials expelled or liquidated just in this brief 4-year period. You had millions of other citizens be killed or die in gulags, which were these labor camps represented here. And the question is, did they die unnecessarily? A lot of historians argue that that was the case, that a lot of the people that were targeted by the purge were not really threats to the communist state. Many of them were sympathetic to communism themselves, but the idea was that these purges ultimately ensured the total control of the communist state, almost that the communists had to create enemies to ensure that they remained in power. Sort of similar to the Reign of Terror in a lot of ways, the fact that someone like Robespierre actually targeted people that sympathized with him politically. So this is one example of totalitarianism. Remember, this is totalitarianism from the right. We are going to move on and talk about Mussolini's fascist state, so look at it from the right in the next section.